things I usually do at the start of the stream. So why don't you give us like one, the like show your channel, show whatever you want to talk about. Why don't you start there?
Yeah, my name is Daniel. I run a channel called Anark. It is a channel about anarchist and libertarian leftist theory, where I basically do deep dives and with an emphasis on philosophy and really trying to lay out the foundations of ideology, not like necessarily intros, but more like deep analysis.
Yeah, someone recommended that I watch your video on After the Revolution. I think it clocked in at 40 minutes, so not
Yeah, that's
not a late
true.
diver. Um, so then I guess the second question I should ask is, you consider yourself an anarchist and a socialist as well.
Yes, of course.
So what would you say socialism means to you? What would a socialist society look like in the near term?
A socialist society, by the definition I use, is a society where the means of production are owned and controlled by the workers.
Mm-hmm.
Anarchism is the opposition to all hierarchies of power and privilege. Therefore, socialism is a subset of anarchism. That is to
But
say, every anarchist is a socialist necessarily.
I mean, I guess the NCAPs would like to fight with you about that, but um, I basically agree with you. Yeah. Um, so then I guess to get a little bit into the meat of it, um, I I think people ask that I talk to you a little bit because I was critical. I am critical of kind of like horizontalist organization of having very local democracy as opposed to more centralized federal democracy. Um, how so? The third question basically would be like, how do you see your ideal anarchist system as the big questions are like distributing labor, distributing resources, making everyone cooperate.
So, what are you asking? You're asking how anarchism differs from a more centralized form?
I'm basically asking like, what are the incentives, the institutions under the anarchist system to make everyone play nice and distribute labor and distribute resources in such a way that everyone comes out better than in the current system?
Well, it should be said that broadly, other anarchists, not myself,
Mm-hmm.
sort of don't like laying out a blueprint for what a future society will look like because
True.
generally that has been associated with utopian thinking in the history of socialism. So, trying to lay out some very specific model of what will take place is generally considered sort of naive or idealistic somehow in leftist communities. Me, I think
Sure.
that we should try to lay out something that at least demonstrates itself to have a sort of clear functioning form, regardless of whether it will look exactly like that or not. So, what I would say is, I want a horizontal confederation of council structures where
Mm-hmm.
each council either functions on full consensus or some sort of modified weak consensus.
Okay. So I mean that's a good start. So what let's just start at the very local level. How do you make sure that communities can say, let's say that you have a hypothetical and your consensus metric is 90% of people have to agree and you can only get 80% of people on board with say like climate policy X. Do you simply not enact the policy? Is there any method for like a large majority but not a total majority to impose its will on the rest of the commune?
Well, under full consensus, the answer would be no. Full
Mm-hmm.
consensus should be something very close to 100%. But this
Sure.
is
I
part
just
of the
picked
reason.
90 arbitrarily, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah, 90, but I'll make clear that, those are considered weak consensus
Yep.
models, if anything short of 100%. I think I would be okay with a weak consensus model, something that was
Mm-hmm.
a little weaker threshold. Now, the answer to your question is sort of complicated. It also involves things like free association. So one thing to keep in mind, let's use your example. Okay, we're at
Sure.
80%. We need to get to 90%. It's say a climate policy.
Sure.
Now, the way I've laid it out in the video that you watched was there was sort of like a multi-tiered process by which you would look at the friendly amendments that people wanted to pass, and
Mm-hmm.
then you go through the process of discussing and trying to pass all of the friendly amendments until you have basically addressed all of those. You've upvoted them and downvoted them and done all the things you were going to do, and then come to a final proposal that has all of the amendments inside of it. If that still only reaches 80%, you have not passed the measure. Number one, that you can either not enact it, or you can take it to another stage of deliberation where you ask for, once again, why is this 20% not consenting? Go through another process of trying to get the extra 10% that is needed, and maybe sometimes that will work. Let's say it doesn't work. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
that just absolutely nothing you can do gets that to happen. Well, you have two options. Either you don't pass it, which is one possibility, or
Sure.
you all undergo free association. Now, different anarchists are going to have different conceptions of how this free association plays out.
Sure.
But almost all of them agree you have the right to be grouped with whatever people that you desire. So if it turns out that that is like a deal breaker for those 80% of people, they are not forced to be in a council structure with the other 20% anymore if they don't want to. Which is to say, if those 80% wanted to turn into a council structure of themselves and then make decisions, that 80% of people can make that decision and move forward with it as an 80%. And that 20% makes whatever decisions they like within a separate council. You could either choose
So,
to confederate those. You could still have some confederated council where those two split councils still meet, or those
mhm.
two split councils could simply, uh, part ways and enact things differently. Another thing to keep in mind is they are nested in layers of confederation. So that is to say, let's imagine the two of us don't want to deal with one another, but we're all part of, say, a regional confederation. Well, the decisions of the regional confederation would still apply to us. We're part of that regional confederation. We came to consensus on those regional decisions. So we can only make decisions within the range of things that are left over after the larger bodies that we are all part of have made foundational decisions. So, like a lot of the time, the people will kind of think up maybe extreme examples which would have really terrible outcomes, but those should mostly be dealt with at the foundational level by some sort of national confederation or global confederation.
So I guess two things that I was thinking about. So one is, have you ever heard of V Taiwan?
No.
It's a online voting system that there's like a whole complicated history to it, but the long and short of it is one of the things that it does is it allows people to take an issue. So Taiwan's parliament did this for a law relating Uber, which is the example that I linked here, about regulating Uber. And what it did is it gave people a series of questions, suggestions that other people had raised, and asked them to agree or disagree. And one of the things that they often found through this process is that there was a way to sort out things that virtually everyone agreed with, that like 80-90% of people agreed with, and that there was no real contention. So they were able to sort out what the actual debate was, as opposed to like what the unanimous consent sort of stuff was. I just thought this is an interesting example, perhaps, of what you're talking about a little bit in the friendly amendment part of your speech.
Yeah, there's a significant amount of sorting that can be done. One thing that has to be considered, and this has sort of been addressed numerous times, when a future model of society is presented, it's always very easy to ask people to need to present some sort of fully functional description of how every single problem is going to be dealt with. And I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the first things that just has to be understood is no society is actually perfect. So, like, whatever
Sure.
society is being built has to come along with some presumption that there is just going to be challenges, difficulties, hurdles that need to be overcome in order to enact any society that we were to lay out. So, one thing that should also be said is just that, anarchist society will not be perfect. There
Sure.
will be disagreements. There will be times when free associated groups of individuals may choose not to associate with one another anymore over splits and decisions the two of them have. I'd like to think that because of the way that confederation and consent would function in one of these societies, that this would be pretty discouraged behavior. People would be more likely to give way on issues, based on the fact that they know that communal consent is necessary to move forward. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of solutions and difficulties.
Well, so I guess to return to the free association thing, that to me actually sounds like a very suboptimal solution. Um, like, to pick an example that's a little more concrete, let's say we're talking about like a local pollution ordinance or something along those lines. Like, hey, our local cooperative factories, they're putting out a lot of pollution. How tall do we want the smokestacks to be? Do we want to force them to have filters? Um, and let's say that 80% want like regulation set A and 20% want regulation set B, and they just choose not to cooperate, even though this is like a relatively local level, stuff like pollution bleeds into other communities and affects other communities negatively. So it seems like you'd need some sort of collective way, at least in my mind, to impose the community's optimal decision on everyone, rather than just leaving the 20% to create pollution that would then hurt the other percent who did not consent to it. In
Oh,
short,
certainly,
this is
that's what
it.
the confederations do.
Well, so I just wanted to make one broader point. You're mentioning that you don't need a perfect model for a future society. I agree. There is like a bit of a utopian aspect to try and think about things too particularly, but I do think that for any model of society, people should try and run it through the ringer of, can it solve these broad categories of problems? And so one
Hmm.
problem, this type of problem, is called like a collective action problem. That like people have different interests, and even though it might benefit the entire group to do something, some individuals might be benefited by going in opposition to that. This is like a classic example, even though it never happened in reality, is the tragedy of the commons. That it might benefit some people to graze from the commons, but it'd be better if everyone like regulated their grazing so everyone could benefit more. So I guess in short, how does your form of anarchism solve that? And you mentioned the larger confederations. Sorry, handing it back off.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's why I went to it quickly because
Mm-hmm.
I kind of familiar with the train of argumentation, right?
Sure.
The answer is that you have confederations, and one of the organizing principles of anarcho-syndicalists historically has been that those who are affected decide. So
Mm-hmm.
that is to say, if you look at the example you gave, right? So the environmental regulation. If you're talking about an environmental regulation on the scale of smokestacks emitting smog, we're talking about something that literally affects everybody on the entire planet. So that's
Sure.
actually not something that locality can decide. That locality has to get the consensus of like some global confederation. It has to get the largest conceivable consensus possible because it is demanding that it has the right to damage the world that everyone lives in. So
Well,
that would not be an example of one where the local assemblies could make the decision that is being
so I guess
described.
then the question for me becomes, let's say that now you have to obtain global consent, right? Let's imagine that we've already assembled the entirety of the global commune. Um, and the global commune comes to some decision, right? They like say, hey, we're going to force smokestacks to be 200 feet tall or something. And the local commune says, hey, we don't want to go along with that. How can the central commune enforce those rules upon local communes?
That's actually a very good example where free association would probably solve the problem. So you're in a situation where that single association has decided that it doesn't want to function on the basic rules of the confederation that it's part of. The
Mm-hmm.
confederation doesn't have to keep them as a member council. That confederation can either go form its own separate confederation, which would probably put it in a pretty significant downside. I mean, that would be a big loss for that very small locality not to be part of a huge global confederation. They would be basically all on their own at that point, unless the larger confederation chose to, do
Well,
work with them.
so I mean, to be clear, right? The example we have to be. Let's imagine it's a weak consensus model, and so it's not just one commune. It's like say 20% of communes, and so now you've got all the communes. Let's say it's global warming, right? You've got 20% of communes who want to maintain their coal power. They want to maintain their oil rigs, right? You've got the commune of Saudi Arabia oil well number 451, and they want to keep pumping because their local industry, their local jobs are entirely based on it. They go form like a secondary commune, and now they do have some of that international power. Maybe it's not as big as the first one, but actually, to bring it to a more relevant question, why would it matter if their international commune has less power? What does power mean that would be important for the commune?
Well, I mean, this is where it kind of comes down to what part of this whole process are we talking about? Because the part of the process we're talking about sounds like it would be in a relatively near future, and it sounds like we're kind of talking about when we're like in the process of undergoing revolution. Because if we have these big of disagreements, like we have, large confederations disagreeing over things that foundational, well, it sounds like we still have a lot of foundational disputes taking place here. It sounds like we're like in the process still of
Do you
undergoing
not think that's
the
inevitable?
revolution.
That there
It
won't
kind of
be.
depends on afterwards. I don't know. I mean, everybody truly does benefit, aside from some very small group of people destroying the planet, from keeping the planet healthy. There's, even in countries where people are being steadily brainwashed by anti-ecological propaganda, you still find that the majority of people want to abolish using petroleum and want to move over to renewable fuels. So it's like, it seems to me that the power structure has to do an enormous amount of work getting people to be anti-ecological to begin with. So I, what I'm saying is, it's not to say that there would be no process by which there would be tensions between these two, but an issue that big seems like one they would already have had to agree on to even form a confederation to begin with.
Well,
Like a confederation which is based on the foundation that that ecological stability is part of its unifying principles would never have formed a confederation with another group that demands that it continues using petroleum and destroying the planet. That
well
would
then,
be a group that is inherently in conflict with the first confederation.
sure. So then the question I would pose is, let's say you want to get from today to like the ideal system where you do have a confederation that everyone involved or virtually everyone involved is interested in these ecological principles.
Mhm.
How do you achieve that in a world where people have such vastly different economic incentives, like oil producing regions and oil importing regions, for example?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about anarchism, there's no economic incentives at all. Those are all gone, right? I mean, if we're talking about a future anarchist society, we're inherently talking about like a so I'll make a distinction here that's
Mm-hmm.
important. Okay, anarchy is an ideal state. Many anarchists would not even tell you that they think that we can achieve a pure anarchy. Anarchy is an ideal state where all hierarchies of power and privilege have either been absolutely diminished or almost eliminated completely. So that's at the end of the day, anarchy is a communistic society. There are no more economic
Sure,
incentives at all; those are all gone. If we're talking about if we're talking about an ideal far future society.
sure.
If we're talking about a society that is still in flux and is still proceeding through, a series of social and economic revolutions, which it kind of sounds like is the situation we're discussing,
Mm-hmm.
then we're in a very different sort of situation. If we're talking about economic incentives and disincentives, and we're talking about a world where there's still conflict, it sounds to me these two confederations are probably going to be in actual open conflict with one another. Maybe not armed conflict, but it seems to me that the 80% of people who chose the ecological dictate are probably going to be trying to place necessary pressure on this other confederation to stop destroying their planet. And given that it does kind of affect the entire planet, it is an act of self defense to like countervail that other confederation, to do what is necessary to isolate it.
Well, and
So
so I to step in, to me, it sounds like if you're at the point where you're talking about international confederations of like local communes making these collective decisions to try and impose, I don't know what kind of power force they'd be like exerting. It could be like soft power, like sanctions. It could be hard power, like military. To me, it seems like when we look at examples of like the federal system in the United States, even, we are able to force certain industries to just close. We are able to force like pollution regulations on industries without any of like there have been no major like conflicts about pollution in the United States. You don't have like warring factions about precisely how much nitrate gets polluted into the atmosphere. It's in
you do,
short,
though.
there's competition, but it's peaceful competition.
But you do have what you just described. It all just takes place previous to legislation. So there is indeed all the conflict you just discussed. The majority of people within this nation do not want to destroy their planet. The majority of people, at least in the United States, I'm talking about, want
Mm-hmm.
to move off of petroleum into an
Wake up,
ecological
Libra.
future.
Hello.
So it seems to me, yes, indeed, that conflict is taking place. It is instead that conflict actually never arises to the surface because there is never an actual process by which we could move into that ecological future in this
Well,
system. The system
so
is built to hold us in stasis. So the system is actually one that deals with that problem worse because it is currently destroying the planet.
so I guess I pointed to an example, which is like the Clean Air Act. Basically, we had a society where we produced an enormous amount of leaded gasoline, and it was banned. Um, Not banned in a single act, but the cars that used it were banned, and therefore it made it unnecessary to produce it. It was de facto banned. This was a huge imposition on all of the car manufacturers. Similarly, the Clean Air Act also imposed these what are called like pollution cap and trade markets, or NOx. I think that's nitrogen oxide, but I might be wrong. And SOx, which is sulfate, or SO4 or something. And in short, those like there used to be regular acid rain in the 70s. The reason there isn't anymore is because we're like 99% down in sulfate. So I guess the reason I point to it is obviously the current system is not perfect, but it is able to impose these coercions on enormous numbers of economic actors without, as far as I can tell, like conflict on the level you'd be talking about, which sounds like it would involve like sanctions or possibly like open warfare.
See, what I'm saying is that it is in fact not actually meeting the burden that you're discussing. It's
Mm-hmm.
not only not perfect, it's not doing anything. Like you can see by the fact that we're destroying the planet, that we cannot actually limit carbon emissions by the scale that that we need. The problem is that in the
Does the fact
example
that
you're
we're not
giving,
doing
there's a
so currently mean that it like can't do so? That the system is broken?
I think the system is broken, but that remains to be seen.
Okay.
What I'm trying to get across here is the example you're giving presupposes a wealthy owning class of the means of production. Like you said, the main conflict in getting this passed is indeed that it imposes on the people who own the means. And you'll notice that's precisely why it's not getting passed, right? Because the people who own the means control
Well,
everything already.
but
So
that's
what
the
you
point.
have
The
is a
Clean Air Act
system,
was passed, right? The lead bans were passed, even though they were
but the
disproportionately
carbon
supported by
emissions are not.
businesses.
The reason that was passed
Well,
is because industry could still function with those new constraints in place. The petroleum industry cannot function if it is transitioned out of. It literally just has to
so
be abolished.
So I agree that like the carbon path the United States was on under Obama, right, was not sufficient to meet the targets we wanted to meet, like basically carbon zero by like 2030 to 2050. So I totally agree with that. But if you look at the direction of carbon emissions, it continued to go more and more negative, even under like a reformist centrist like Obama, who imposed higher and higher standards on cars. Was one of the big things he did because transportation is like 20% of U.S. emissions, and so it seems like the system, maybe it can't do enough, but it certainly is able to force these impositions. Uh, so I guess the question I'm asking is, if we imagine in your world that instead of it being capitalists owning these factories, it's now workers owning these factories, do you think that worker-owned factories still operating in a market system would not have a strong incentive to keep those factories open, to keep like the oil production and refinement going?
Are you
Or
talking? You're talking about the
yeah,
system that's in after the revolution, not necessarily a
yeah,
pure anarchy.
yeah, to be clear, like I think discussions about like communism or like the end state are basically impossible. They're like year 2500. I'm talking about year like 2050 or year 2100 or something plans. What do we do
Right.
in the here and now?
Well, one thing that should be said is that, the people who are in those industries are still affected by the damage that those industries do. A big reason why
Sure, a
those
bit.
people that they cannot change the nature of the industries that they are working within is because they don't have any power. The people who have all the power are the people who are incentivized by, stocks and maintaining large profit margins. So that is to say that all of the incentives are built into the system to make it do the opposite of fixing those problems. Whereas in a system where the workers own the means of production, at least there is a possibility for the workers to choose otherwise, for them to transition their company out of petroleum and into something else. That's something they could choose to do. Under the current system, they are unable. So then what you have is a system that is highly undemocratic. You have a system by which, in order for the workers as a society to stop the ecological damage that is being done, first they have to convince a representative in an authoritarian government to impose sanctions on the people who re-elect him, which is already very infeasible and usually fails, and when it doesn't is usually only for band-aids. And then that has to be imposed on your boss who owns the means of production and is very likely going to skirt those regulations or not even follow them. So that is to say, think about that bizarre circuitous path that had to be gone through in order for that simple
Well,
need
sure.
to be
So then,
enforced.
what's the path in a worker cooperative firm? Let's say, a concrete example, coal mine in West Virginia, right? Workers work at the coal mine. That coal mine selling stuff to coal power plants. Let's say you want to shut down coal power plants. Why would the coal mine workers, assuming we're still operating in like some form of market, not have similar incentives, not identical, but similar incentives to their boss to keep the coal churning, to keep the money rolling?
Well, first of all, because they are citizens of the world in a way that their boss is not. Their boss is, what, three, four people at the very, very top of the firm, the board of directors, a very, very small number, making decisions that really only that affect the entire globe and for which they see very few of the actual outcomes. whereas the workers, because they're more numerous, actually experience the outcomes in a much more direct fashion. They see what they are doing to their planet. They are part of a overall confederation, unlike the CEOs who are separated from the effects of their actions. Number one. Number two, it should be said, I think any functioning anarchist system that's being discussed, part of the universal confederation's laws should be, ecological dictates about how
Mhm.
things must function in order to maintain an ecology that functions for everyone. And that would just simply preclude the usage of petroleum fuels from the get-go. So like there wouldn't even be a coal factory in West Virginia because there would be no coal extraction. Or if there was, it would be very limited coal extraction, which is not being used for, the things that is currently being used for. Coal can be used as byproducts for some useful things in industry. Same thing with petroleum. It can be used for a million things, including plastics. But what would not be allowed are things that cannot have strong emissions disentangled from them. So there just wouldn't even be an industry that could produce those emissions, because the presupposition in the Confederation's laws would just be that you can't even do that industry. That's like not even an industry that which would exist.
So that's,
Uh,
I guess, my point, right? We have those industries now. We want to get to a position where the industries don't exist. And you talked about the Universal Confederation. But I think, as I mentioned, the question is, why wouldn't they just leave the Universal Confederation? I, but the basic question is like, if why do we think so? Let me pose two things. One, on the first thing, we were talking about incentives a little bit. Let's say that the worker does experience more of the consequences of global warming. It's not a question of whether they experience it, but it's how much more do they experience it. And so the average worker versus the average boss is, let's say they're experiencing 10 times as much the effects of global warming. For the average person, those effects are relatively small. As compared to like the entirety of your livelihood, that is almost certain to be larger. Um, I think there was this example that I was going to mention a little bit before of the 1948 Donora smog, which was like a really famous example in pollution in public health circles, um, where there was this town in Pennsylvania that had short smokestacks. That's why I was mentioning the short smokestacks. And the two like my factories in the town, there was like a weather event, and it moved all the smog down into the town, and it killed 20 people and gave 7,000 people respiratory disease. And yet they kept going back to the factory. Um, so I think the point is like, yes, they're doing so under the current like somewhat coercive system, but it seems like people are very, very willing to keep going back to work even when it is literally killing them, when like their town is literally being smothered by their pollution. So I guess the thing I wanted to pivot to a little bit was, it sounds to me a lot like you're trying to talk about non-market mechanisms for getting these people to do these things, so that these people wouldn't be coerced to do so. They wouldn't be coerced to, like, say, produce coal or produce in these factories. So how do you ensure that people work like productively in the broad sense? How do you ensure that people produce the things that are needed by other people?
I mean, it seems to me that this would be information which would be conveyed in the Confederation. This would be information that would be gathered, distributed. There would be a lot more localistic building in an anarchistic society. That is to say, many of the facilities which provide for people would not be as distant as they currently are. There would be much less need for mass distribution, and the infrastructure would be built with that in mind. But if
Well,
what is it you're really getting at here?
so I wanted to pick like a hard example for localist anarchism. Let's say it's
Mhm.
something like, there's an example from the Bronze Age of all times, when tin and I think it's copper were only produced by around like 10 mines each in the world. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
if you wanted to make bronze, you had to get tin and you had to get copper. So you had to trade it
Mhm.
over these like thousands of miles. No
Mhm.
single village could have both tin and copper without like an
Mhm.
enormous amount of trade, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. So how do you make it that the commune that produces good X and another commune which does not produce good X but needs good X to like produce something in addition, such as bronze or like computers or something along those lines? How do you
Mhm.
ensure that those goods get transported?
Once again, it depends on which stage we're talking about. So, like in like an immediate term sense, if you're just talking about a market of cooperatives, those cooperatives are controlled by council confederations. So that is to say, it is not just the market sorting the way things would function in what's in after the revolution. because no entity within the market functions above the councils. The councils control everything. So people that control those councils are the ones in the confederation that they are in, that together with the confederation determine the distribution of goods. So if there's 10 in one place, well, you're not really separate. You're part of a confederation together. So if you need that 10 where you're at, the confederation together, in the confederation, the two of you would be able to work out that you need tin and they need copper and so on. It's
Sure.
just
And then
it's
what
a
do you do to like make that actually happen? Like what do you in
they just
short, like
transport it.
sure, they just transport it, but why? Like I guess that's basically the question. What's in it for them? Why would they
We
keep doing it?
they want to function. They need those things, like as you described. They
Oh,
need
sorry.
both of
So I'm
them
saying
need
like
tin and copper.
let's say the tin one, right? They're transporting the tin. What's in it for that tin commune, which let's say is like 1,000 miles away? They're like
Well,
they're not even close to the local confederation.
first of all, when you say what's in it for them, there's a presumption that they're still functioning upon these very capitalist
Yeah.
modes of thinking,
I mean, you
right?
just talked
And
about
I just don't.
mutuals in like a mutualistic market, right?
Right,
So
but one thing that has to be understood is that in the restructuring of society in this way, we are presuming a society which already understands that it necessarily functions on a broader distribution network. So, like, people are not going to be doing every single thing that is going to be done is not going to be done with the presumption that you immediately benefit from a mutual exchange based on. There are going to be larger systems at play. There are going to be mechanisms by which things can be distributed between them that are decided by the council confederations beforehand. Just the simple fact that, why do I give that village 10? Well, it's the same reason why I am allowed to get this computer from two communes over. Because the two communes over understands distributing computers means they also get all of the other amenities of society. It's a society predicated upon the first principle that you distribute to people who need, and you will have distributed to you what you need. So,
so I mean, so this all sounds nice if the people all agree with that, right? But I think the whole point that I've been trying to bring up is that sometimes people have economic interests that are at odds. Like, to give an easy example, let's say there's a limited natural resource and two communes both want supply of that natural resource. There's like one unit of it and two communes want it. How do we decide which one gets it?
yeah, I think that those are the places where, like, in the Confederation, they have to decide that together. There has to be a process of deciding that takes place.
Sure.
Like,
But then once they decide, what enforces it? Like that's it just the
see,
reason I
this
talk
is
about
where I
incentives
think
is they're an enforcement mechanism. They're a way to make people do
mm,
things.
I don't know. I'm not convinced of the broad need for enforcement mechanisms. I think that there are enforcement mechanisms of a variety of different kinds, up to the usage of militias, but I don't think that would be necessary. I think that what you would have is instead that there would be a lot of democratic pressure, and the pressure of other people preferentially or non-preferentially doing trade with what they find to be greedy or selfish communes. I think those communes would be heavily socially sanctioned for basically calling the entire project into question by trying to essentially reproduce capitalist logics.
I mean, I have
But
a lot of trouble believing that people will actually follow through in that. Just, I understand that today's society, today's mentality can't perfectly be mapped onto like an anarchist society, but it is so easy. Like, if I ask most people, hey, where did the farm that your lunch came from come from? They don't know. Where did the shoe
exactly.
that you wear come from? But they probably won't know it under this new system either. There's enough consumption that people do that it's hard for them to be informed about a lot of these things. And even when they are informed, people still choose to buy from like child labor camps. Like, it doesn't seem to me like relying on people's desire to make other places better is good enough. People happily buy like Nike and happily buy like Vietnamese
But that's
barbecue.
because not buying Nike does nothing to stop Nike. Like, it just literally makes no difference, and everybody knows that. That's why we say there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, because it's pointless. It makes no difference.
Sure.
And
But then what
I
does the commune
disagree.
do, right?
Well,
What's the
the big
difference between
difference
the
is they actually are in the process of actively administrating society. Like you say, people in this society don't know where their food came from. 100% true. And the largest part of why they have no idea where their food came from is because they actually have no control over it. They just aren't privy to the knowledge because they are not part of the, process of administrating, coordinating resources. But in a society where there is confederations of councils all getting together making decisions, of course they will be part of that process of administration and distribution. So in fact, they will actually know, or maybe they won't literally know exactly where it came from, much more likely than the people of this society to know where it came from. And unlike the people of this society, who cannot simply stop Nike from using slave labor by not buying Nike, the people of this society could simply actually be part of a democratic body that changes the functioning of that commune over there, which apparently uses slave labor,
Well,
right? But
well, I mean, that's the whole question. It's how do they enforce that? What power does Commune A have over Commune B?
well, in the Confederation, number one, once again, I don't
Mm-hmm.
believe that enforcement does almost any of the work in society. Like it does, I would say maybe a single digit percentage of any actual like following of laws, I think has very little to do with like physical, actual like threat of violence and imprisonment, which is what we currently use. Most of the time people follow rules because they're just part of the social compact.
Well,
I don't not murder because there's a law against it. I don't not steal because there's a law against it, and so on and so on. We're just talking about the things that generally have to be enforced by force are those things which are unnatural to society to begin with. That being said, I will concede to you, of course, there's going to be some small group of people, or perhaps there will be some small, percentage of the population that is not going to function by the social compact and is going to try do what it can to accumulate power within a future society. And in doing so, there will have to be some mechanism of enforcement. But such a
mm-hmm.
hostile entity could be countervailed through the usage of militias. Like there are militias in an anarchist society. It's not a disarmed society. And there will be bodies of military violence. Like those will exist in an anarchist society. Those bodies will be necessary in order to defend people from reactionary violence if it should so happen to rear its head, from any external forces, as if indeed we are previous to global revolution. So those bodies will exist. They'll just have nothing to do with the default behaviors of how society is built. Like
Sure,
if
but
if
so
there is
I guess to return to a bit, I asked what power does Council A have over Council B, like Commune A over Commune B, and the answer at like in the macro scale is, let's say that Council A was like using like child labor, and all the other councils disagree with that strongly enough to try and impose their will upon it. They can use military force to either prevent Commune A from accruing more power and trying to impose itself on the others, or to like defend the children in that area. Sure, it just seems like these are the kinds of things that could be resolved more peacefully through those impositions of laws. One thing I would also like to note is that there is an effect in psychology known as like system justification, and there's like a dozen. I have like a fun example of it. Not fun. I have an example of it in gay marriage. After the law changes, people change their ideology. They change their ideas along with the law because what they think of as normal changes. So in states that a majority of people supported the legalization of gay marriage, after the passage of the gay marriage law, it jumped up by about like 5 percentage points, the people who supported gay marriage. So I don't think these things are fully like exogenous, right? One informs the other. Um,
That's what I'm
so
trying to get at, though. If you change the compact of society, people will follow the compact of society. Like the new justifying philosophies of justification that will underpin that society are going to be a radically different set of philosophies of justification. They're not going to be philosophies based upon meritocracy and bootstrapping and Protestant work ethic and rugged individualism. Those are things that, in order for a revolution to be successful, you have to go through the process of dismantling and demolishing. So we have to presuppose we're talking about a society with very different social norms. That's one thing that I'm trying to lay out. Number two, what I'm saying is that society is not doing good at dealing with any of the things you're describing in its current form. So you said,
mm,
a child labor. Child labor didn't go away. They just started using it in other
but
nations instead. And you say, well, we made it
but
illegal
they've
here.
always been
Indeed.
using it in other nations. That
But
like the
that's the
as a
point. That's the
percentage of
point.
children laboring, it's lower today than it's ever been.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the truth. As we've moved forward, we've realized we don't need as much child labor, and the system has allowed, or rather, capitalism has determined for itself that it does not need as much child labor in order to get things done. And the extreme presence of labor movements have pushed the standards for workers high enough that there's not an extreme usage of it. But notice it still gets used. So all that really happened was they just shifted the
Wake up,
burden of
Negro.
child
We
labor
love you.
to a more or less privileged nation. So it doesn't seem to me it really did anything about, or it didn't fix the problem. And that's
But
really what happens in this representative system. The
I mean, so
system is
the
incentivized to do what are essentially small tweaks to twist the knobs a little bit, and to maybe and usually just do superficial aesthetic changes, but it will not, it refuses to actually undermine the fundamental principles by which it functions.
Well, so to return to a comment you mentioned a little bit earlier, you said that you think that the impact of like laws of the threat of the use of force is like single digit impact on the way people behave, and I just think this is like clearly not true. I have like offhand, I would just point to some examples from like firearm legislation. We know that like there was a famous example of uh, firearm control in the Israeli military. After Israeli soldiers were banned from taking their firearms home on the weekend, suicide rates overall among that sample of Israeli soldiers dropped by 40%. And all of that reduction was due to reductions in suicide on the weekend. And there's like a dozen other examples. Like I think,
But what does that have to do with my example?
well, it's because it does seem like laws change people's behavior. The reason that they don't kill themselves is in part because we've taken away their access to do so.
No, I said the threat of violence isn't why they're doing it. Indeed, the law may have been why they changed the behavior, but I don't think that the law having an attachment to the
I,
threat of violence is the reason they did it. They did it because the law changed.
Well, sure. I mean, I could point to the polluters one with the Clean Air Act, right? Like, I don't think that if we were talking about these business owners, as you mentioned before, why do they care about following the law? Well, it's because either they're going to pay the fine or go to jail if they don't pay the fine. It is
Or
ultimately the
they
threat of
just get away
force.
with it. Or they just get away with it like they do, like what we see,
I,
right? So like the
I mean, I
law is
can
passed and they ignore it to a large degree.
not this one. No, like we
The
this is actually
EPA?
something we can measure.
Yeah, the
Um,
EPA has been gutted. There's very little actual regulatory oversight, very little actual, looking at any of the emissions of these companies, especially here in America. The EPA is almost an empty office. So, you know, yeah, there's a reduction, but what you'll notice is the behavior still continues because the system cannot not do that behavior. It
well,
does
I
not
mean,
contain that possibility.
to be clear, also they didn't ban this behavior; they phased it out slowly, using like a continually restricting market, more or less. But it
All right.
seemed like the people responded to that force. Like I posted in chat a graph of the two examples are SO2 and NOx, which is sulfate and nitrogen oxide. And you can see that there's like an enormous reduction in both of these. It looks like SO2 is down like, I don't know, 75%. NOx is down like 75% since when we started passing these laws in 1989. And so
Yeah, I agree. The laws definitely will change people's behaviors, but you'll notice the polluting continues. So they stopped with these particular chemicals. That's
well,
nice and good, but we're experiencing global ecosystem collapse.
but I guess my point is this isn't just these chemicals. I have examples for lead. I have examples for ozone.
And you
We
could,
can go on and on and on.
but then you would also find a ton of examples of replacement increases of massive ecological damage, the increase in CO2 actually in the atmosphere. You would find accordingly there are massive ecological damages being done despite the reduction in these particular chemicals. And I'm glad that there was a reduction in these particular chemicals, but it kind of seems to me like, we're like somebody got shot with a bullet and we like picked out one of the shards of lead and we're like, see, we picked out one shard of lead. And it's like the dude is bleeding to death. He's been shot, and you're over here happy about a shard of lead being pulled out when the fucking slug is still in this guy's body. That's the
I mean, if we want
situation
to
that it looks
fully
like here.
analogize this, a guy got four shots in him. We took out three, and then we did like we're planning to take out the fourth. I guess basically
I'm saying
my
that
question
none
is
of that
this:
happened. I'm saying
we've
one shard of lead got, and then he got shot more times while the shard was coming out.
I, so The problem with this, as far as I can tell, is it seems like the US is not a great leader on climate change because one of the parties, the National Conservative Party, the Republican Party, is like so extremely opposed to it. But there are numerous countries throughout the world where, even in like places like China, where they've begin reforming the way that they're producing power. Like some countries, like France, have just totally decarbonified, they're not totally, near totally decarbonified their electricity generation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it seems very hard to say that like we can't pass these laws when we are currently in the process of passing these laws.
But we're not. The planet is being actively destroyed and has been for quite some time now. I mean, once again, it's not succeeding, it's failing. We're like in a process of failure. We're already past the tipping point. We already
That
failed.
one's just
The
not
question
true.
is
I
how little will we fail?
Here, one moment. Um, so I do think that climate change is an enormous issue, but I do also think that there's a lot of discourse around it being like just an apocalypse that's like we've already hit tipping points, and this does not seem to be the consensus among scientists.
When I've
Um,
looked it up, it was. So we can compare notes later, but I've read studies talking about this. So, I mean, present whatever studies you like, but I can look some up a little bit later. Yeah, see, this starts
sure.
with a straw man. The majority of us will be dead by
N-
2050.
No, it's
Never said
quoting
that.
someone. No, it's that's why it says that. I was just quoting some guy. Um, I'm not trying to say that's your position. So all I was trying to mention is like in this study, for example, most of the estimated impacts they're talking about would occur in like the 3-degree region. And most of them in
Uh-huh.
turn would take several, like usually around 50 years to 100 years to take effect. It's not at all clear that we're like quote unquote past the tipping point. And given that we'd be projected to reach 3 degrees, I want to say in like 2060. I don't remember which route we're on at the moment. Like to say that we're like on imminent collapse and if we don't have immediate action does not seem to be true. Um,
Oh, you've misunderstood what's happening here. You're right to say that we are not at the degree mark where those damages are taking place, but that's not what's being discussed. We're talking about a variety of feedback cycles being put in place that are going to place us on an inexorable move towards that. The feedback cycles are already in place. That 3 degrees is basically guaranteed.
that doesn't seem to be the position of like most scientists, as far as I
It
can tell.
does. I'm literally just like regurgitating what I've learned from scientists. I've been in the scientific community.
I, sure. So this could be true. If it were true that it's actually inevitable, then it would actually make the case for reducing carbon dioxide
we
worse.
are
As
It's
right?
about hitting the brakes. Okay, we're heading towards a wall. We're going to hit the wall. The question is what speed are we going to hit the wall?
But if you said they're inexorable, then if you're hitting the brakes, you're
Right, the
still
wall. We're going to
no,
hit the wall. The
no.
question
But
is what speed are we going to hit the wall?
sure,
They've
okay. Then the
set the
argument is just how
cycle up.
quickly.
The system as it stands put us in that situation. So it doesn't seem to me that looking at obscure possible thought experiments of a future society where possibly workers want to destroy their own planet is less likely to deal with the problems than one where a series of hyper concentrated authoritarian hierarchies have to be forced by extreme effort, bloodshed, riots, and long term parliamentarianism is a superior solution. It seems to me like we're looking at a situation where, in fact, the majority of people, the democratic will of the people, is the one that would go to work fixing these problems immediately. Yet we have a society that is built such that it doesn't meet those needs. So I
Well,
can't
so I
see
would be
how the
happy to
society
agree
that
that the U.S. democracy in particular is not a great democracy, but the if we want like, again the point that the overarching point is if let's say the United States was more democratic and we did implement these policies, what would be stopping us from actually doing those policies? If like Democrats were properly represented in the Senate, for example, and the House, or and like the presidency, right? If Democrats had controlled it for 6 of the past 7 presidencies, how are you to know that we wouldn't have achieved these laws? Like, if your argument is simply the
because
system
they're
isn't
bought
working
by those
because it's not
companies.
democratic enough, and therefore, since the system isn't democratic enough, we need like local communes. Why can't I say the system's just not democratic enough? Keep the federalism, make it more democratic.
Because if indeed you agree the system is not democratic enough and the solution is democracy, why are you half-assing it? Why are you not just going full democracy so that
I,
people can just make the decisions
sure,
themselves?
because I think that like throughout this conversation, there's been a whole load of like collective action problems that I think are posed for these small communes. Like even the example of Yugoslavia is a dumb but relevant one. It's that in Yugoslavia there were like 8 relevant sub republics, and each of them really, really wanted money from the central budget. And so they would take and take and take, and they'd do trades with other ones. They'd like build a factory in one place and not in another, so that they could then give another factory in one place and not the other. You have like trading of economic resources, because people desire more power. And it's possible that you will change the way that people act so significantly that this is no longer the case. Um, but
the system I'm
no
talking about, you just gave an example of a system that maintained the hierarchy of the state and markets, and I'm talking about a system which has abolished the hierarchy of the state and abolished markets to a large degree. Rather, it's making very few, if any, of its decisions
Sure,
based on
but
markets.
even
So,
before markets, under feudalism, which had extremely small markets, the vast majority of people had no money whatsoever, right? There was no money or market economy for the vast majority of people.
mhm,
People still accrued power happily.
mhm.
And it's hard to believe that communes, even Italian communes they were called, even they would still try to accrue power. They would still try to fuck over their enemies. Like even in the long, long ago of ancient human history, people formed states. And it seems to be that part of that is if you don't accrue more power, others might.
That's not an accurate representation. But so I want to start with a few things here. Okay. So I agree with you actually that one of the problems with building any system is that people will want to accrue power. That's
Mhm.
actually why that I have this system. This is why I'm an anarchist, because I think that the hierarchical systems are actually way more susceptible to those power hoarders doing damage. Systems that are decentralized and horizontalized are the ones where singular power hoarders have the least influence and can do the least damage. This is why you distribute power to begin with, so that you don't have power hoarders having systems pre-built for them to just go in and grow like a cancer. Any hierarchy is a system by which some power hoarder can take it over and then exploit people. So it seems to
Sure.
me
I mean,
like
so then let's talk about like a local communal council or something. And local communal council is having some rough times. They want to appoint someone to deal with some like emergencies. That one person can easily accrue power. How do you avoid those sorts of situations?
delegation. Delegation just means they can be revoked at a whim. So
Right? I mean, ideally, right? But
that's
power
just what
isn't.
delegation is.
But
There's no other way
power
to
doesn't care
appoint
about
people.
words on a paper. Like it's a real thing. So I guess that like if you look at I don't know like I very much like the theory underlying that of keys to power, which I think CGP Grey did a video on. It's like from a book called Rules for Rulers or Rules for Dictators, something along those lines. The basic premise is that like the reason people hold power is because they can promise some degree of power, some degree of kickbacks to other people who in turn enforce their power. It's like loyalty. Democracy is just spreading that very, very large. Like you vote in a politician because they promise they'll give something back to you. So it
Mm,
doesn't seem that hard to me to believe that like if there's factories, for example, in a, like a cooperative market, those factories could start to create like loyalty mechanisms, keep people loyal to them, and screw over other factories.
it depends if once again what kind of society we're talking about. But like, okay, so I just want to analyze that metaphor, the key to
Mm-hmm.
powers, that you think that the reason people have power is because the people under them allow them to have power because they get
It's
kickbacks.
not always just like the people as a whole. It's often like other elites in like the feudal system. You've got like all the local lords who agree with you because you give them more power than the other local lord.
All right, I'm just trying to understand, is this a justification or
This is
what
just a
is it?
description of how power works.
Okay, so then you're saying that power in the feudal order was because the lords let the king have power, and that power in this society is because we vote for people?
The concept is that the way, let's say that there's like two competing people who want to be king. The question is fundamentally who can distribute more dividends, more kickbacks, more payment, whatever you want to call it,
Mhm,
more
mhm,
keys to like the people who would give them power. And so what you see in coups is that someone will come in and they'll get the support of the military, who also has power. And so
mhm.
now that they've got the support of the military, they can kick out the old guy who does not have the support of the military. So
So you're just saying that powerful people trade power. Like, you're just saying that
Yes.
powerful people are self-interested, that power seeks more power? I mean, yes,
Y-
that's,
yes,
yeah,
but it's
trivially
easy to
true,
imagine.
not no offense intended.
Sure, but then it seems like this is the kind of thing, like we have seen this for millennia. It is very hard for me to
Wake
believe
up,
this would not
nigga.
occur in
I
a
love you.
like anarchist society.
But what I'm saying is that this society is the one built towards preventing what you're talking about. All other forms of society are the ones more susceptible to the problem you're discussing.
I mean, like this is it's possible to claim this, but I don't think it's possible to like demonstrate
How
this.
is it not demonstrably the case when power is the most distributed that power hoarders will have the hardest time getting power?
Because so the easy example is because everyone at the communal level has been distributed, right? Then if one of those communes tries to fight with another commune, it is easier for one commune to fight another commune than one commune to fight the entirety of the rest of society. So
But
in
that's
like
exactly what they would have to do.
only if all the communes stood with them. Let's say that you have like a 50-50 split. Half the communes might just screw over the other half of the communes.
That would happen now under the state system.
I it could, but generally right now counties
It
don't
could,
fight. No,
but
but
that's the
like
point. You're trying to talk about hypotheticals. We're talking about hypotheticals. Let's
the
pretend now we're back in the feudal era talking about the possibility of the
counties
United
did fight
States.
back then. They fought all
Well,
the time.
yeah, but that's kind of the point I'm getting across. So let's imagine we're two feudal serfs right now, and we're talking about how the United States would function. And then somebody says, "Why? What prevents 25 of the states from siding against the other half?"
The
And you
federal
say,
government.
"Well, they would have to it would be like this
No, it's
big
the federal
military
government.
conflict. There'd be a lot of friction to that, and like it's just way easier to go with the system as it stands." And like
No, it's
the
because
person
there's
will go, "Well,
top-down coercion. It's the federal government. That's the missing ingredient for like the purely horizontalist system.
it's not. I already described how militias would exist."
Well, but so those militias themselves are controlled by these horizontal communes. If we imagine
Yes, the
a
the
split that's like
confederations.
50-50, it's very easy to imagine that they will fight against each other, but they can't do so. Like if 10 counties in Pennsylvania disagree with the other 10 counties in Pennsylvania, they can't fight because Pennsylvania, the federal government will stop them.
Okay, so what then? Once again, now just analogize. What do
Yeah,
you think would happen in the confederation?
sure. So like either they would separate and you'd have like broken all of the benefits of having one unified administration, or they'd fight. Both of these are suboptimal outcomes.
Or they would simply come together and make a decision about how they should agree as a confederation, how they should form the future of what they should do. See, the thing is we've got lots of examples of what I'm talking about. Like if you look at the way indigenous societies functioned for thousands of years. In fact, it should be said the way I'm describing things is the vast majority of human history. You're
the,
talking
the
about a
vast majority
blip
of
in the
humans have the vast majority of human history of like for the vast majority of humans has been living in highly hierarchical societies,
incorrect. Quite the
either one
opposite.
under a
Quite the
state
opposite.
hierarchy or two a moral or cultural hierarchy.
No, we're talking about hierarchies of power, not just hierarchies of concepts.
Yeah,
That's
no,
not what we're
the
talking about.
second one is also power. Cultural elders have power. It's just in a less forceful way.
Yes, but they held power because people were like willing to actually like go along with what the elder says because the elder had age and the elder was considered wise. They followed what he
Sure.
said because he presented wisdom. He was like seen as someone who knew much. You just followed the person who knew things.
So this
During this
one's
period of
actually
time,
sorry, go ahead.
this precedes there were it just has to be said humanity existed for thousands of years without states or authoritarian hierarchies of any kind. They had maybe the very mild one you were talking about, the hierarchy of the elder. Bookchin would agree. And they then at some points had like a hierarchy of the clergy and things like that. But what you will find is that in all of these societies, when the councils held power, these authoritarian behaviors were weak and made few decisions within their societies because those positions of authority, take for example the military brotherhoods,
Wake
were
up,
all
neighbor.
subverted to the
I
council
love you.
systems. So okay, we have a more modern example. So let's talk about like the Zapatistas. When the Zapatistas came to the indigenous people in Mexico, what happened was the Zapatistas were an authoritarian, centralized sort of vanguard organization. They
Mm-hmm.
came to the indigenous people. They said, "We are doing war on Mexico, and we are trying to figure out, do you want to be part of this? Should we do war? Are you part of our struggle?" And literally all that happened is they just said, yes, but you will subvert yourself to the councils. And in that process, the military brotherhood of the EZLN, previous to this arrangement, had to submit itself to the councils. It just literally had no power if it didn't. It is a submissive body to the councils. So this structure, as what I'm describing here, also happened a ton of times in indigenous Native American in Native American society and Native African society. It is not just simply the case that the power hoarders, just like every society tends towards the power hoarders winning. And insofar as that we can look at all societies and compare them side by side, the societies which were built hierarchical to begin with are the ones that where the cancer of power hoarding is the worst.
So I guess the two things I would raise here is, one, are you like familiar with the data on pre-state society murder rates versus like state society murder rates?
Yeah, I've read so much debunking of all that.
Okay, so then what's the debunking? Because
That
almost all
we
the
don't
readings seem to suggest they have a
actually.
higher murder rate.
Yeah, because all we have is like these bodies. We just have bodies. We're just doing archaeology and we're digging up bodies with like, some sort of damage of some sort. That doesn't take into account how many of them may have in fact been killed in some sort of like ritual, which is to say that, their society had some sort of ritual killing, which is not the same as conflict and warfare between these societies. Also, the rate of people being preserved is much higher if indeed it was ritual killing, which would of course make the numbers just wildly inaccurate. The fact that a lot of these bodies that were recovered in situations where those tribes were in conflict. I mean, there's just a ton of different things that make those studies really, really weak.
Sure, so let's say those evidences are weak. We can look to a more modern example where we have like better preserved bodies at the enormous reduction of murder in Europe, where we have the best data sets. The estimate is that murder was somewhere around like 50 per 100,000, 1,300. Today, which I think by your standards, there's like enormously more state and hierarchical power today than there was in like 1300, just measured as like a portion of how much of your life is controlled by the state. There is 50 times less murder per person. The same
Yeah, I
trend holds true in the
disagree.
United States.
I disagree with your first contention, which is that we live in a society where we have less hierarchical presence. That's not the case at all. We are a more democratic society now than were under feudalism.
Okay, so sure, then if we can claim that the reduction of murder is due to increasing democratization, that's fine. So what evidence could we actually look to like, basically, what evidence would I look to for your theory that we can't see the acquisition of power in these societies? You pointed to the Zapatistas. I don't know much about the Zapatistas, but how do we know that there won't be accrual of power when you have a bunch of communes that are fully established, that aren't under like another state, that they won't just accrue power?
I mean, once again, like, okay, so power, by power, what do you mean? Define power for me.
Sure, ability to make others do as you desire through force or otherwise.
All right, that's fine. That's functionable. We can use that. If what we're talking about is coercion, you're talking about coercion. Well, coercion just would not even be the easiest way to get things done in a society where there were huge confederations. So let's use indigenous Americans as an example. Okay, so you can see that there was a variety of different kinds of indigenous American societies. You had some, like the Iroquois, for example, which were a confederation of council bodies, like I'm describing. And in fact, they had no problems with any central power structure rising inside of them. They had no issues defending themselves from external people that were trying to coerce them. In fact, the Iroquois Confederation grew quite steadily until the time came of colonialism. So when we look at the models we have, the ones that seem to survive best and have the least actual occurrence of sort of cancerous power growth are these decentralized, horizontalized societies. And this, of course, makes perfect sense. Why would the society where power is diminished to the maximal degree in individuals be the society where individuals are best able to gain power? That's the
It's not
society
necessarily that they're best
preconditioned.
able. It's that I think that they might be slightly more able to do so than in like a functional like federal system.
But they have so much power right now. How do you justify that when we're looking at a society that has an oligarchy
Sure.
ruling the planet?
Because, so I guess the thing that I wanted to bring up a little bit is many of these examples that we're talking about are pre-industrialization. And so it's difficult to argue that their context apply to modern contexts, both for your and for my argument. So the Iroquois, for example, and many of these other indigenous populations also did not develop industrialism and did not like conquer the world. It seems like the states where they did accrue central power, where they did move towards like a capitalist society away from like a more feudal or agricultural or self-sustenance society, those were the ones that grew enormously economically and technologically and destroyed the rest of the world. So let's imagine for a moment that
That's
there
an
is,
oversimplification.
I mean, sure.
Yeah, we could go real deep into that one. I mean, one thing that has to be said is that it's not only the societies with extreme centralization that underwent, rapid increases in culture and science. I mean, for example, Greece produced far more advancement in philosophy, science, and culture than Rome ever did, and Rome was 10 times more authoritarian. The biggest difference is that authoritarian power is power that is built to be highly coercive of populations. So of course, an empire is going to be good at being an empire. That's just obvious. But it's like, for example, Mongolians were more centralized, more authoritarian than the Romans, yet they burned the libraries of Alexandria. So like I don't think there's
The
any
argument
correlation
here
between
the argument here is basically that these centralized powers, because they centralize power, can crush other decentralized powers.
But that didn't happen with the Iroquois, for example.
Uh,
The
what
Iroquois were
happens
one
to
of the
them?
most powerful indigenous cultures, and they were the confederation of 5 smaller tribes, none of which were gaining too much power, nor did they have any of this problem of despotism. In
Sure,
fact, they
but
defended themselves from being besieged until the colonialists came. And from most of our in-depth historical record, it appears that they would have put up a good fight if not for the disease.
well,
So
sure, but we can look to this in other areas, right? If you want to talk about indigenous African civilizations, they were all crushed. If you want to talk about indigenous Indian civilizations, they were all crushed. Southeast Asia, crushed. Like
they were crushed
virtually
by
no
their
area
own
on the earth.
internal They
Basically, I'm
were
just saying,
crushed
like,
by internal struggles, by the internal growth of authoritarian power, and because they lacked strong confederation. The
sure.
places where they have strong confederation, what you said is not true. The places where they have weak confederation, what you're saying is true.
And so these arguments aren't like to someone in chat. These arguments aren't why it's just. These arguments are like descriptive. It's that I am worried that in a system of high decentralization, of where I think it is easy to quote unquote divide and conquer, that if like say one confederation decides that it wants to accrue more power at the expense of other confederations, it can accrue that power and then hurt other confederations. Um, and so that's the concern there. And you do have like some wars in like the modern context, and to some degree that's because I think that we haven't fully federalized. I would prefer a world federal system. As but the basic like argument that I'm trying to raise is that I don't think that these systems have great responses to like authoritarianism. But I think that we've talked this one a little bit to death. So we can talk more about authoritarianism if you'd like. I think the point that I was trying to raise a little bit before this, and maybe this can be the point that we like close out on since we are getting to maybe an hour and 15 minutes or so, is basically what systems, what incentives actually encourage people to do like economic trade, for example. What encourages people to like go to work every day in the factory and be productive, be innovative?
Depends on the system.
Sure.
Under our system, of course, it's going to be coercion, right? It's essentially starve. Your alternative is to starve, right? That's the reason. Under our system, the Protestant work ethic does a huge amount of work. Bootstrap ideologies, rugged individualism. These all drive us to a conception that the only reason why we should produce is because we will be rewarded for it. However, what you find is that the human beings produce in all eras, and they produce quite prolifically in all eras and under really all systems. For example, I'll answer your question, but I just want to get
Mm-hmm.
to a more concrete example of why I'm going to say this.
Sure.
So, in the Spanish countrysides during the Spanish Civil War, they went straight to communism. One of the rare examples where they actually went straight to communistic social principles, distribution based on need and production based on ability, uh, complete abolition of the market. The literally only remuneration was through labor notes, which is like lower stage communism by Marx's definition. And productivity went up, not down. None of them were being given money anymore, or not, traditional money. None of them were trading on this capitalist market, yet productivity went up. Or take, for example, worker co-ops. In worker co-ops, when workers have more power, when power is less authoritarian, when it is more decentralized, productivity goes up. My answer to the question is that humans naturally want to produce. We are satisfied in the process of production. We want to produce things naturally. We are, however, gate kept from the full realization of our ability to produce by hierarchical authoritarian structures. Those authoritarian structures gatekeep the ability for us to produce meaningfully because they profit from it. That gatekeeping is the mechanism by which they derive profit. So, my answer to the question is humans naturally want to produce. You need to only give us a system where we have enough comfort that we can produce prolifically, and we will do so.
So I agree that I would like a system of worker cooperatives, but the problem that I have with this is the worker cooperatives we're talking about right now are existing in a market system where they are paid for doing more. I think
Mm-hmm.
the simplest argument actually for why worker cooperatives work better is that the workers within them have stronger financial incentives to work better because their success is more closely tied to the company's success. In like a conventional firm, only the boss's success is really tied to the success of the firm. Everyone else just gets paid the wage. So by stuff, there's actually tons of studies showing that in addition to worker cooperatives improving productivity, having horizontal management structures and having worker like stock ownership, worker shares, it also enormously increased productivity. So I don't think this argument actually lends itself towards the side that like we don't need incentives. Just for some clarity, I'm a market socialist. I think that I very much like these incentives to make people to go to work, and I don't think that it's true that when you remove them, people work as well. Um, I don't. I think the only study I could think about that I would have on hand to cite on this one would be, if you want like an empirical example, would be that when we pay teachers based on how well their students do, it does improve their students' performance. It does improve how well the teachers work.
All right. Yeah, I understand. No, I mean, I actually agree with your critique there of me using co ops as an example, but my usage of co ops there alongside the example of the CNTFAI in Spain
Mm-hmm.
was to demonstrate that I believe the principle at play is that when people have more control over their lives, when they are given agency and autonomy, that is when they invest. They invest in when the process is of them, that process is no longer alienating, but is in fact they can see the outcome of their labor and they can see that it has an effect on society. So when I'm looking at a greater society, a confederation of these council structures, what
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at is a society where people do see the outcomes of their work. Why would
Mm-hmm.
they distribute freely to the rest of society when they could, like a miser, hold the cards to their chest? Because they see that the greater expression of their inherent desire to produce things is created in the full confederation and distribution of things,
So to
right?
interject a bit, this sounds a bit like you're describing what some people have called like a gift economy. That they're doing so because they gift it to other people and they like enjoy seeing that those people enjoy those things. I might be using the term gift economy incorrectly, but it sounds like that it's a you're describing like a one-side, non-transactional sort of relationship for why people would produce.
Uh, yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of similarities between what is being described in, like, say, Marx's upper stage communism and a gift economy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you're misusing that at all. I think that's pretty. That's a fair way to describe what I'm saying. Uh,
So I
that
guess
being,
the sorry,
no,
go
go
ahead.
for it.
Sure. So the classic critique of stuff like the gift economy, as opposed to like a market or even a planning system, is that markets and planners can force firms to adopt like productive techniques. So if someone is producing something only because they enjoy doing something, they might not enjoy like having to radically change the way they produce something. They might not enjoy having to adopt new technology. They might or they might not, and it's not clear which one would like win, as it were. But under a market system or a planning system, the planner or the market can force all firms to adopt increasingly productive technology because otherwise they can't compete or they don't get paid.
Yeah, to me, even though you may be right, and we could have a discussion on that, and we could tease all the details out, but it's not really the point I'm trying to get across here. Is that we should want a society that has infinitely increasing productivity. It sounds to me like we don't just need productivity for the sake of productivity. We need efficient, organic, ecological productivity. And it seems to me that a system that merely prioritizes productivity for its own sake is one which is not going to properly deal with the other concerns in that list, right? It's not going to be ecological. It's going to be death oriented because it seeks infinite extraction. Productivity comes at the cost of blood and sweat of the workers. So
Sure,
infinite
I mean, I
productivity isn't
totally
necessarily
agree.
good.
I agree that productivity in itself is not an important goal, but the reason productivity is important is because, so like to give you an example, right? Per unit of GDP, the United States uses 40% less electricity than it did in 1960. So part of that is a shift away from manufacturing, but also even within manufacturing, there's been enormous increases in manufacturing efficiency. So if you like assume that we have to maintain some like fixed energy budget, we have some fixed resource budget. Productivity also means getting more out of each resource. I think there's like I want to say it's an anarchist or some sort of like ecological concept of like a circular economy. If we're limited by the size of that circle, by like the sustenance of the earth, getting things more and more efficient, innovation is the only way you'll see long-term growth, long-term increases in the ability of people to like do things. And if you want to get to that anarchist like to get to anarchy, to communism proper, where you don't need to like have any of these systems people can simply take, then it seems like these are the things that are really important. There's a model in economics called Solo's growth model, and in short, its assertion is the only driver of long-term growth is increases in technology and human capital. And so the reason it's important is not just because I want productivity. It's important because this is like the ultimate determinant of how well people live.
I would say I want to disentangle here productivity and efficiency. It seems like you've made them synonymous when they're not. So I'm just
Oh, I mean, just
trying
in
to.
economics they are, but like that's so when I say it, I just mean efficiency.
Okay. I just want to be clear that I do not see those two things as synonymous. I mean, you can be highly productive and highly inefficient, which is to say, I could make 100 widgets per day when it's normal to make 50, but waste as much as 400 widgets in order to do it, and that would not be efficient, but it would be highly productive.
Sure. No, no, this is just talking about it's like inputs and outputs. And so I get the point that I'm just trying to raise is I'm not sure that it's very easy to argue that in a market system, a well-designed market system or a well-designed planning system, that you can align everyone's incentives with the incentives of society. In like a market system, people want to produce for profit. The only problem is if profit's not aligned with people's need, so then you have to like subsidize certain things or tax certain things to make profit align with people's needs. In planning, assuming you've got a good planner who can like approximate people's needs and calculate it all the way back, then again you've got a way to decide what should and should not be produced. But that basically my point was it's not entirely clear to me how someone, if you're like the factory, the widget factory in commune 4635, that you know whether you should be producing more widgets or less, whether you should be using machine A or B. It's not clear to me that these incentives are clear to you.
The mechanism by which that would be conveyed to you would be through the like network of confederations. So I mean, it seems to me as if one of the most efficient ways to deal with that problem is to actually create a group of people who are looking at places where some product is not being distributed fully, or places where it's being over distributed, and then giving that information to the commune such that they can make better decisions on how to distribute. As for your previous contention about central planner, I have to
Mm-hmm.
say, if you're looking at systemic problems, central planning is just a dead idea. Like, it literally has nothing left to it. Like it has been utterly and completely demolished by generations of scholars at this point. And I would say the great, the grave marker has been placed on it by James C. Scott in Seeing Like a State. You're just never actually going to have that planned system. It's not possible, because you must reduce the complexity of the information on the ground in order to make those decisions, and thus your decisions will always be reductively tied to the metric you have chosen in order to make the decision. I highly recommend that book, by the way, and for anybody else who's interested,
Mhm.
Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott. So yeah, central planning has a real problem. One of its biggest problems is reductionism. It is highly reductive, and the problem here with having central planning plus a market economy is that the metric by which you will be reducing information and complexity is upon a metric which is all money. It's just literally all a number. It's maximizing a number. And that's very dangerous. The commune system, a confederation of these council structures, is at least one in which the people can organically make the decisions of what needs to be done based on the information upon the ground, not just some number that comes to them, not just by distribution of commodities, but instead by literally, what do people need? What do people want? What can we produce in different places? That can be determined organically by the councils. But a number, in my opinion, will only worsen our ecological problems.
Well, so that seems like a good spot, maybe. So I think originally I had asked how long you were free, and you'd said maybe an hour or so. So I think I've gone over that by like 20 minutes or so. So I apologize for that. Would you
Oh,
be
it's all
happy?
good.
I figured that might be like a decent spot to close the conversation, where you've given a critique of central planning and of market systems.
Sure, sure. Yeah. If anybody's interested on my further critique of the state, I did a 4-part series called "The State is Counter-Revolutionary," but the first 3 parts and most of the fourth is really mostly about why state socialism is not actually possible, or rather, why the state is a counter-revolutionary entity when we're trying to achieve socialism. But part number 4 goes into James C. Scott and Seeing Like a State. So if any of you are interested in what is being said in that book, I present a summary of it at the end of part 4 of that series. But I enjoyed our conversation, and
Yeah.
I didn't know what to think ahead of time because I really didn't look too much at the YouTube channel. And I'm glad that you're not like a debate bro or something. I could have walked right into that, like, trying to just get dunks.
Well, I try not to get too many dunks, except where they come to
That's
me.
good. I enjoyed
So
our conversation.
no, I greatly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess. Oh, last thing. So final. You should do a final shout out. You talked about your video series about Seeing Like a State. Why don't you just remind people what your name is, where they can follow you, and maybe what kind of content they'll see when they get there.
Yeah, yeah. My name is Daniel, but my channel is Anark. The channel is essentially anarchist and libertarian leftist theory. I do deep dives more than I'm really doing like primers, but I do mix it up sometimes. But it's for people that are really genuinely curious about like the foundations and the deep inspections and analysis of anarchist and libertarian socialist theory. So yeah, go to YouTube, go on there, type Anark with a K, Anark. I also have a Twitter. You can find that at Aperophobic, Apeiro phobic. And yeah, I also have a Patreon if you end up liking my content. But yeah, thanks for having me on.
Of course. And I linked your shit in the Twitch chat if people want to click that. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening.
Yep, talk to you later.
Thanks. All right. Do they have an OnlyFans? Tommy Boy looks like he's on coke. I, you too can get access to the coke that I'm on my OnlyFans. I tried. Here, let me show you guys. Can I show OnlyFans on stream? One moment. So I tried to set up an OnlyFans, just to post memes on because I thought it would be funny. And I posted one meme, haha, it's very funny. Hey, want to come over? I can't, I'm streaming. My parents aren't home. Brr, exercise bike, go brr. But when you put it into an incognito, I don't know if I can. One moment. When I put it into incognito and I'm not logged in, right? It just says user is inactive. What does that even mean? I just posted something. I don't know how to solve this. So I'm a little sad. I don't get how I'm supposed to do this. I can't post memes here. Yeah, I was shadow banned. They saw my post and they were like, "Oh God, that guy's gonna drive everyone out of business. This guy's running out of time. Our site's running out of time. He's stealing it all." Seesaw asks for a RuneScape stream. No, I guess some thoughts that I had on the conversation. So one, I was glad that I brought on someone who was relatively informed on the structure of anarchism. I feel like I feel like the three issues that I tried to discuss were economic coordination, potential rise of authoritarianism, and economic incentives. Those were like the three issues, the three critiques that I usually have of anarchism. One Bad Apple says, "Sorry you lost the debate. Good discussion regardless." No, I easily won that. I just destroyed him, okay? Just like he said, I'm a debate pro. I had the baseball in my hand. I just dunked it right through the rim. I got a 10-point home run.
Bro. I love you.
Starling, please stop giving me money. This is the last of my rent for the month. Please send me toe picks. Stop giving me money. I just took I took the soccer and I hit it right out of the park. Home run.
Wake up, liberal.
I appreciate all the follows. Oh, I guess I should do the standard thing. Guys, there's this parasocial relationship aspect of the human brain. By me talking at a screen and you looking at that screen with your eyes and hearing my words, you think that we are friends. And we are not friends. But if you want to show how close of a friendship you have with me, it would make me a friend of you if you click that follow button, if you click that like button, if you click the subscribe button, and gave me money. Those are the things that all my friends do. My friends love clicking the follow button. So those are the three critiques that I usually have of anarchism. Again, it's economic coordination, it's like rise of authoritarianism, problems of horizontalism, and economic incentives. And usually the fourth one I raise is like universal human rights. How do you ensure that every commune respects certain like basic decisions? But I didn't get too much into the fourth one, because usually that one gets a little bit more toxic. Ziploc says, hot take, parasocial relationships are just one-sided friends with benefits relationships. What? Where's the benefits? What benefits am I getting? Money? You guys should all unionize. That you could force me to give you some actual, like, good shit. Femboyism says the landlords are coming. Well, read up on Mao, okay? So I felt like their response to economic coordination and economic incentives, I felt were pretty lacking. Their response to the authoritarianism one, I felt was much stronger. I think that, I do think that they have a good point in that highly horizontal systems probably are highly resistant to authoritarianism, and I don't think I'll raise that argument in the future. Because I think that, so this is an argument that I used to raise against Nozick style libertarians, where they want like local anarchist councils, not anarchist councils, local like communities that set their own laws. It's called like voluntarism or localist volunteerism. And you'd like, if you don't like the laws in community A, you just leave and you go to another community. Yeah, I didn't want to talk about racist communes because then it often just gets very, very toxic. People are like, how dare you suggest the proletariat are going to be racist or something? So I try not to discuss that this time. So the authoritarianism one, I do think is true. There's something, I recently read a book by Darren Acemoglu and Robinson called, what was its name? The Narrow Corridor. And its argument is fundamentally that, like, if you have a strong society and a strong government, then it's very hard for you remain in something that they call the shackled Leviathan, and it's very hard to arrive at despotism. And so I think that the argument that they're presenting fundamentally, and they didn't phrase it like this, but I'm going to try and rephrase it, is that they want a very quote unquote strong government, because the state would be involved in nearly every aspect of economic life. It would be like making sure there's a lot of equality, there would be no economic elites, and simultaneously there would be very strong society, in the fact that everything would be communally organized, everything would be extremely horizontal, everything would be extremely local. So people have a strong buy-in to the systems, they have a strong degree of control over the system, people don't feel as alienated. So and I don't actually think that lens, I don't think the Acemoglu book is very good. I don't think government versus society is a very good setup. But I do think that, like, through a variety of lenses, it is probably more resistant to authoritarianism than I gave it threat to. The sub part of that I didn't like the answer to was the other critique of the Nozick system is, okay, let's say that your system is generally good at keeping authoritarianism out, right? Let's say the current system, there's a 1 in 100 chance that like an authoritarian rises up to power or something along those lines. And this new system, it's 1 in 1,000. Okay, so you've reduced it by 10 times. Good job. But that authoritarian still might rise up. And so what happens if that authoritarian does rise up? And this is the concern that I have about these localized communes in the context of anarcho-capitalism. It's that a big firm might rise up and take out a bunch of other smaller firms, take control of a lot of other local communes. And similarly, in like an anarchist context, it'd be that one commune. Let's say it's the one racist commune, right? Every other commune on Earth has decided they aren't racist, but the one racist commune has decided to rise up and break free of its confederation and force its will onto everyone else. Trundlesk says it's kind of called democratic municipalism. That's usually like the left-wing version of it. Municipalism and like a anarcho-capitalist side is usually called voluntarism, or it's like one of the types of voluntarism. At least that's what I've heard it called. So I don't think these semantics are too useful anyway, but it is important to know the name of things. So my concern there is that someone could rise up and like conquer over other communes because they're divided. And basically you're relying there on like a united front against these sort of like invader communes. And I think it's possible, but the problem is always that there's like this threat that it's not enough and that they do come in and they do take control of you. Because even if we've established this perfect world, perfect anarchy all over the entire world, once you've got this one big centralized commune, as it were, which is now like a hierarchical system that's conquering other communes, and it seems like that system could spread very quickly. That's the concern, basically, that it would gobble it up. So that's my fear. But that one, again, I don't think that I have a lot of empirical evidence on one way or the other. This is like such an extremely theoretical issue that I don't think I can prove it. So the other two issues, I felt like the economic incentives one is pretty weak. I feel like basically the gift economy has very little incentives to innovate, very little incentives to be efficient, other than those of like innate human productivity.
I love you.
Starling says, what if I told you that I was 25 and had published in Nature, PogChamp? Neat. Good on you. Glad you got published. Tell me who your professor is so I can steal them and get my name on a paper. And then the other one was the economic coordination one. And I feel like the answer that they gave is like about these networks of trust and confederations. And I just don't have faith that these communes will work together efficiently to like all pursue the interest of the collective, just because in the current system, it is so hard to find examples of people willingly working together for the benefit of everyone without something in it for them. And I suppose that maybe we can radically change human psychology, but I'm not sure that I'm willing to believe it can be so radical. If we were going to do this guy's idea of, I think they were he, him, so this guy, if we were going to do this guy's idea of anarchism, then I would definitely want it to be like an incrementalist move where we move closer. We have like my ideal federal system, and then we like break it down a little bit, and we have like one less layer of federalism, and then we'd like test it out for 100 years or something, because I would be very, very worried that we can't actually achieve this. And I'd like to see like broader scale, long-term empirical evidence that it works out. Because the example they cited are like the Zapatistas, who already exist in like a state system. To some degree, like in Mexico, they aren't fighting off foreign invaders, they aren't fighting off authoritarians taking over, except I guess maybe companies. And like the CNT FAI, which also existed in a state context, the Spanish Republic, and lost. They lost to the authoritarians. and they only existed for a few years at best. So it's very hard to see what the long-term effects there would be. Anyway, those trying to do a little Steelman recap at the end. I feel like my argument of authoritarianism mostly fell apart, so I'm probably not going to use that. I'm going to remain mostly focused in critiques on anarchism, about economic coordination, economic incentives.
Wake up, liberal.